Good morning, good morning. My name is John Palfrey, and I have the great pleasure of introducing this second panel on storage and retrieval. I work at the Harvard Law School, where I study youth and technology and intellectual property and things like that. But I also have the honor, though a non-librarian, of being director of the Harvard Law School Library. And with that hat on, it gives me such pleasure to see so many people here seeking to answer the why books question and coming together in physical space as well as in virtual space. I've been in the Twitter sphere all morning as well. Those of you online at the hashtag #WhyBooks will know what I'm talking about. It's a vibrant space there too. But to Anne and Leah, Dean Gross, Nancy Cotton, others, congratulations. What a triumph this is to be here at Radcliffe having this conversation and to have more than 600 people try to cram into a 300-person room. It's just a thrill. Two tiny notes from me before introducing an exceptional panel of two, and then a few of the quick logistics for this panel. From where I stand at the Harvard Law School Library and studying youth and technology, I have the experience of watching students interact with information in lots of ways. Thanks to all of you who came over to visit the Harvard Law School Library. It's not very far away. Turns out to be the largest collection of academic works in law anywhere in the world. Has a wonderful rare books collection and so forth. And if you happen to walk into our big reading room in Langdale Hall, I think you will find that it is packed with students and, in fact, the occasional faculty member at nearly all hours of the day, so much so that during exam time we have to keep undergraduates out, much to the chagrin of the undergraduate dean. Sorry, Dean Hammonds, but we're too full. This is a wonderful thing, I think, in part because it speaks to the intellectual life of our community, but it's also, I think, because the books are there that students come, not just for the fast Wi-Fi. But if you watch what our students are doing, they very often have a laptop in front of them, doing precisely what Bob and Stuart were talking about, multiple tasks. And though I rarely see them pull from the shelves, law journal or legal texts in the primary format, they almost always have their casebook beside them in which they are writing as they prepare for class. It is the hybrid moment of the digital and the physical that we observe in our students right now. This is anecdotal evidence, but many studies show much the same thing, that even for our students, those that we sometimes controversially call digital natives, that while they expect photos to be in a digital format and uploadable to Facebook, while they watch videos not only on the television but in YouTube, the #2 search engine in the world, while they almost certainly listen to MP3 files and not LPs or CDs or anything else, making iTunes the largest music retailer in the world. The one anomaly is text, where, yes, they rarely read newspapers and they prefer their journals in searchable form. When it comes to a book, a text like this, a codex, you find often that this is the one place where there's an anomaly in talking to young people. They often say that they prefer the printed text, the printed book. They use the same language as adults, the 3 Bs, the bed, the bath, and the beach, as reasons why they prefer this format still to the ebooks that they introduce. Now, I'm not sure if this is just the last bastion of the analog world in terms of how young people relate to information, or if it's something that will be enduring. But I note it as an anomaly from the research, and one that gives, I think, many people a great deal of hope. If I had one of those cards, I would have asked of Stuart in the last session what he makes of the iPad interface as a next step beyond the Kindle. I think we might hear some of that from Matthew Kirschenbaum, who's on his iPad right now at this moment. That's Palfrey if you are tweeting. Yeah. Thank you. I'm teasing. They're more interesting than I am, so I will finish with this. But I wanted also to do one other thing before introducing these two scholars, which is in this room I see a number of people who are in the library profession. Just as we ask this question, why books? Many people are at the same time asking why libraries. After taking over the job of a librarian, though a non-librarian myself, at many backyard barbecues, I've been asked, isn't that fun? You're just there to dissolve the library, right? Google guy, that kind of thing. And my answer, of course, is no. I see a brighter future for libraries. But at this moment, I think in history, there's a fair amount of anxiety on the part of those of us who work in libraries about what our future is. I'm determined, with many people in this room, to build a bright future, not just for books, but for libraries and for librarians. And I wanted just to take one moment for all of us who are not officially librarians to acknowledge and thank those professional and non-professional librarians who are here and elsewhere for all that they do in the service of our community. So I want to make a thank you. I assure you it's an extraordinary community here and elsewhere, and they deserve our great thanks. Okay, on to the panel. We have two amazing people to hear from. They will each speak for 25 minutes, and then we'll have roughly 35 minutes for discussion. We will use the same note card approach. These are two people I have never met in person before just now, but I have met them through their books, which I think is actually a neat way to meet people. Adrian Johns is a professor of history at the University of Chicago. He's chair of the Committee on Conceptual and Historical Studies of Science, quite a cool thing to be chair of. The book I got to know him through is one called Piracy, out this year from the University of Chicago Press, which I commend to you. It's on the intellectual property wars between Gutenberg and Gates. It's a wonderful read, and I look forward to hearing what he has to say this morning about the use and abuse of universal libraries. He'll go for 25 minutes. And then Matthew Kirschenbaum, he's one of the people on Twitter tweeting this event. He's also a professor of English at the University of Maryland. It's through his book, Mechanisms, New Media and the Forensic Imagination, that I came to know him, a great title from a few years ago from MIT Press. Piracy is from University of Chicago Press. And it's much acclaimed, multiple awards and so forth, and you'll know why if you read it. I will say no more other than to send you to find it. And he will talk about the textual condition, and he sends his regards to Jerry McGann, on whose other work he is playing. Adrian Johns, thank you so much.
So thank you very much, and thank you to Anne and Leah for organizing this extraordinary event and inviting me to take part in it. I'm most grateful and flattered. Rather awed, actually. So I want to talk about the idea and practice of universal libraries, collecting them, putting together their storage facilities, and what happens when you retrieve things from them. This is something that, of course, is a big deal right now because of the G word, Google doing this massive scanning project that is really promising or threatening to transform the way that all of us work, not just academics, but everybody out there in the world. I want to say that our focus of attention should be on the uses of universal libraries like these, and not just on, as it were, the fact of their existence or things like classification criteria or composition. Because I think if there is a big transformation here, it lies at least as much in the realm of practice, or purpose, if you like, as it does in the realm of collection itself. So in other words, I think one should, to put it in a rather highbrow way, ask the Aristotelian question of universal libraries. What are their final causes? What are they for? What are their purposes? And as a historian, I want to add that there is a history to the purposes of universal libraries. Ambitions for universal libraries are very old, as somebody said this morning. You can take them right back to the Library of Alexandria if you want to. There is a history not just to their collection or their projection, but to their purposes. Their purposes have changed over time. And that matters because even though a universal library is, I think, probably impossible in principle, the fact that one projects it for a certain purpose can change the culture within which it is projected. So it actually changes the conditions of culture, if you like. So why does the Google project exist? Well, one engineer at Mountain View, Google's headquarters, suggested an answer when an internet aficionado called George Dyson went to visit one day. We are not scanning all those books, he said, to be read by people. We are scanning them to be read by an AI, an artificial intelligence. And he was referring to what the proposed Google settlement calls non-display uses, or non-consumptive research. On that account, what's really transformative about this universal library scheme, what's different from all the universal library schemes before, is that it supersedes reading itself, that it's done at least partly with a view to being examined, used, by people who are not human readers. Now, as it happens, I don't think that engineer was quite right. I don't think that the Google Books project really is directed primarily at what might be called machine learning, because if it were, then the metadata concerns that people have raised would have been more troubling to Google, and Google would have been a little less kind of insouciant about them. Still, the fact that a statement like this could have been made, the fact that it's even conceivable, is very telling. And it may well prove, in fact, to be the case, as Pamela Samuelson has argued, that the data mining uses of this archive will end up being far more economically consequential than the reading uses. But compared to what Google calls display uses, that is to say, everything that involves actual reading by humans, non-display uses have received scant public attention. Now, that's not entirely our fault. Maurizio Borghi and Stavroula Karapapa of Brunel University in the UK have pointed out recently that the concept of a non-display use is historically very unfamiliar. So when you hear about somebody using a book as a stool to sit on, for example, that we take that as being a rather isolated individual case. We don't have something like a classification system for non-display uses. And in fact, the idea of such a classification system could barely have been imagined before networked digital systems. Uses that are carried out on books treated en masse as data without any actual eye seeing any actual page of any actual book are radical departures from prior practices. And it seems that there's virtually no legal tradition that would shape and constrain the world of non-display uses. And there's little by way of explicit ethical reflection. There's no tradition of ethical reflection to draw on either. When it comes to human readers, we have something like 300 years of copyright law and copyright debate to argue from and to put to use. When it comes to machine readers, we really have almost nothing. The constraints and consequences of machine reading can, though, be quite significant. For example, Google's own restrictions on data miners, unlike those on human readers, are quite strict. They include a rule that no product can emerge from such a project that would compete with Google's own ventures. Furthermore, there seems to be no right, except a rather short-term limited one, for an author or a publisher to opt out of non-display uses. The Google settlement's much-discussed opt-out provision really covers only display uses, that is, readings. If a framework for some kind of rule to cover this kind of thing doesn't come into existence soon, then I think what we will have undergone is a redefinition of publishing and authorship, and in fact reading themselves. These terms will come to take on new meanings, which will incorporate the fact of the matter that everything we do in these spheres will involve integration into data mining systems. And it'll become part of the role of publishers and authors to anticipate this fact and to make decisions accordingly when they decide what to publish and in what form, just as they've had to anticipate readers' responses for centuries. So what's distinctive and potentially revolutionary about this project is its coincidence, I think, with a new realm of practice. And that raises, of course, questions of law and policy, which are quite profound, but it also raises historical questions, questions both of and for history. How have the practical purposes of universal libraries varied over time such that we've got to this point? How did they promise to threaten or affect the practices of knowledge, and how, in fact, did they affect practices? So I want to suggest that this kind of history matters for considering where we are now. And it's this kind of history, moreover, that's given rise, in fact, to many of the problems that the Google project now faces. So as I say, we could, in principle, go back a long way to talk about this, but if you want to ask about the uses of, say, the Library of Alexandria, the evidence is extremely thin. It's hard to say anything very useful about it. So I want to talk instead about a rather more recent turning point in the history of universal libraries. Think of the terms that are at stake in our own time, romantic conceptions of authorship and creativity, for example, the practices and institutions of research, the travails of the publishing industry, the virtues of mass access. All of these have their historical trajectories, but they did come together at an earlier moment. And it's the moment when Romanticism encountered the advent of a mass culture industry and the origins of the research university. It's the moment, if you like, of the first half of the 19th century. And in particular, roughly the generation from 1800 to 1830. Like our own, this was a period that saw a media revolution, if you like, coincide with radical pressures on the academy. The academy was changing a lot, and so was publishing. First, iron presses and then steam presses transformed publishing into an industrial enterprise. A commercial realm of mass print came into being, centered on the principle of copyright as the enabling device of speculative capitalism in this world. The publisher, as the master of this kind of lettered property, appears as a distinct social kind in that generation. And the power of this whole system is exemplified, for example, by people like Sir Walter Scott, whose novels sold in unprecedented quantities and basically created entire fields of culture for entire genres. At the same time, the cosy world of the university was being upended by post-Jacobin reforms in France and by the beginnings of the Humboldtian reforms in Germany that would create the idea of a research university. Now, it turns out that in these same years, there was a very bitter struggle over proposals to create and sustain precisely a universal library. It would be housed in the, quote, public, unquote, institutions of the academy, the universities, and it would be devoted to collecting the output of publishing that was now becoming this industrial enterprise. The debate was not just about collection and selection, though it was about those, but it was about use too. That is, it's partly about the practices of research itself and about the institutions that that practice would define. Now, this bid for universal libraries emerged from the widely accepted claim that printing had made enlightenment possible. This being so, it was thought essential to collect the output of the press in order to preserve existing knowledge and facilitate future progress. So the idea is that enlightened societies ought to have libraries aspiring for universal coverage, at least in some sense of that term, and that these libraries should be, again in some sense of the term, public. They should not be the preserve of castes devoted to mystery of state and priestcraft. Now, in England, which is where this debate arose, the approach to creating a universal library was actually quite pragmatic because it rested on the ancient universities, Oxford and Cambridge. Those libraries claimed a right to get a copy of every book published in London, a claim that descended ultimately back to 1610 with the foundation of the Bodleian. More directly, though, the claim derived from the copyright law. The first copyright statute in the world in 1710 included a clause that said that all books registered for copyright had to be submitted to Oxford and Cambridge and a number of other libraries to be collected. The same law that gives rise to what we think of as intellectual property in letters also gives rise to this deposit requirement. Now, this wasn't really transformed very much into practice through the 18th century, but in about 1800, the university libraries suddenly resurrected it, and they began to claim an exhaustive right to collect all newly published works. And this is a new demand that reflected a growing awareness at Oxford and Cambridge that they needed to change, and that research might become part of their raison d'etre. There were just two problems with this. One was that they really hadn't made this claim before, and the other was that they didn't want to pay for what they collected. So the possibility of a universal library, and hence of perfecting enlightenment, was intimately linked here to the fate of copyright and hence to the emergence of a mass publishing industry. And contemporaries saw this, and they saw the bid for universal libraries in terms of a tension between what were two cardinal principles of England's post-Glorious Revolution sense of nationhood, that is, property and public knowledge. Now, briefly, the conventional story about copyright is that in 1774 it was kind of settled in a legal case in the House of Lords in England called Donaldson versus Beckett, which decided that copyright was an artificial privilege created for a limited term by statute. It's not a natural right or something like that, at least not once things have been published. And subsequent battles over copyright are generally thought of as something like mopping up operations. But this was also the age when Romanticism came to the fore, and for Romantics, copyright is hard to actually reconcile with their notion of creativity. It's hard to think that one has something like a natural genius in oneself and correlate that with an entirely artificial, limited term sense of the right that emerges from publishing something. So it stayed possible to argue that literary property, far from supporting genius, was incompatible with it. What sparked that possibility into a fierce controversy was the fact that copyright in practice became wedded in this way to the bid for universal libraries. And it was as a result of this that by the 1810s, you can find a powerful alliance of authors, scientists, scholars, and publishers arguing in London that copyright is in their terms, fatal to literary property. Now, during the 18th century, the London book trade interpreted copyright in the spirit of contemporary political economy as a kind of bargain. The idea was that it was a tax, the deposit to the library system was a tax paid for piracy protection. So if you were publishing a book that wasn't likely to get pirated, you didn't need to submit it to the deposit. You didn't need to register it for copyright. This was the idea. The result of that is that through the 18th century, the books that were offered to the university libraries were those most likely to be pirated, so sermons, novels, things like that, plays. They were often characterized as kind of riff-raff in the 17th century word. So scholarly books, like law books, for example, increasingly stood outside this system. And worse still, in the case of multi-volume books, like encyclopedias, a bookseller might register just one volume for copyright, so that volume would get deposited, but that would force the library to pay for the rest of the set. So it became something like a strategy. So the way that deposit and copyright were linked risked turning the libraries into universal repositories, not of learning in their eyes, but of hackwork. And it looked like piracy, or the risk of piracy, was becoming the de facto definition of enlightenment if the universal libraries were repositories of enlightenment. And in practice, though, the proffered works tended to be so unpromising that the libraries frequently didn't even bother to hold them. They would just throw them out, essentially. And this selectivity was defended by all sides as virtuous as well as necessary. Now, the resentment within the universities about this burst out in the early 19th century, really because at the end of the 18th century, the courts ruled in England that you no longer had to register a book for copyright protection. And this removed the one thing that might get the publishers actually to submit books to the libraries at all. So by the very early 19th century, Cambridge, for example, was receiving about 20 titles a year, at a time when the actual output of the London trade was maybe 20, 30 times that. So if university libraries were really an essential tool of enlightenment, then this was clearly a serious cultural crisis. And Cambridge decided that it was going to ride to the rescue. It began demanding a copy of every single book published on the basis of the letter of the law. And in 1812, it won a test case, saying that yes, indeed, it did have a right to everything published. And suddenly the publishing industry then faced an enforceable universal collection practice. And it's that predicament that led to copyright being denounced as fatal for literary property, because it looked like the universal library would now be built, but it will be built on the basis of essentially expropriating everything that the publishing industry was creating. So it would be a form of universal piracy, if you like. And this would become, or so the publishers said, a prohibitive tax on the production of knowledge itself. And the publishers weren't alone. They found allies among some of the foremost authors of the time, primarily because the prospect of a universal collection on this principle ran counter to a prized romantic conviction about genius, because, as Wordsworth most famously declared, the Romantics' conviction was that real knowledge, the product of genius, real art, therefore, because of its reality, because of its genuineness, is unpopular. So it exists kind of below the calculus of copyright considerations that lead to the publication of things like big novels, Scott. So Genius produced very small print runs, 50 to 100, and yet the number of copies that have to be deposited is not proportionate to print run. You still have to give out 9, 10, actually by this point 11 copies to the libraries. So the idea is this is a tax specifically on genius. And that argument in turn revealed deep-level assumptions about creativity and commerce and how they should be linked. The Romantics maintained that the link between copyright and deposit was more than merely contingent. It actually epitomized for them something that was going rotten in their culture. They thought that copyright in general had brought into existence a culture of print that necessarily neglected originality and genius in favor of popular appeal. As they put it, there are few works of great genius adapted to the general reader. So whatever is deep, whatever is abstruse, whatever appeals to the highest qualities of the mind was necessarily fitted to interest a very limited number. So valuable copyrights, therefore, generally attached to works that were derivative. And they actually did pseudo-quantitative calculations to show that 95% of major copyright work was second-hand. In other words, copyright that was intended to bolster creative originality, for these people, had generated a realm of print that was antagonistic to it, antithetical to it. By contrast, the readership for advanced works of mathematics or natural science was often 200 or less, which flew below the radar screen of copyright considerations. So this practice of universal collection militated against real research, real advance. And with that we approach the argument against the universal library of the Romantic age at its kind of deepest level, because it's really about the prevailing culture of print itself and how that culture impinged on knowledge, on advance, on enlightenment. Knowledge not just as an abstract entity, but knowledge in the making and in the reading. Copyright was allegedly representative of a new age in which political economy, that is the economics of Malthus and Ricardo, had become the queen of the sciences. Collecting everything would make great libraries into testaments to this new age of calculation. Properly, the campaigners thought collecting should instead be an active practice involving selectivity, discrimination, and responsibility. It should be an act of polite civility, carrying meaning for those works that were actually chosen. And if this principle were abandoned and a universal library embraced, then in practice the results would be disastrous for readers who went into this premises. Because who, for one thing, would sacrifice themselves searching for success in the more difficult branches of science if the reverence and celebrity which in enlightened ages have attended authorship are destroyed by giving equal preservation and the same place of distinction to whatever the press vomits forth, as they put it. So this levelling effect would have a kind of demoralising influence on culture at large. And they conjure up images of readers, by which they mean basically you and me, going into a place like Cambridge University Library and being so depressed at the sheer mass of mediocrity that's on the shelves that they will give up becoming original authors forever. As Monty Python said, I know I have. Anyway. So for Romantics, and in alliance with the publishers, the Universal Library threatened to extinguish the most valuable creativity of all. The demand to collect knowledge would destroy the practice of producing it. And they actually had real evidence they could point to for this. Thomas Longman, for example, the great publisher, testified that he'd scrapped an edition of Humboldt because the collection by the libraries was going to be so damaging financially that the edition was unsustainable. Now, so by the 1810s then, there's a momentous alliance going ahead between science, scholarship, and poetics on the one hand, and metropolitan commerce on the other, against the idea of universal libraries. And in particular, what kind of crystallized this opposition was the claim the Universal Library, the university libraries had, to collect not just new works, but reprints. Because this posed a direct threat to the most fashionable form of genteel scholarship of the day, which was antiquarianism. Now, we tend to think antiquarianism is really boring and very dry and so forth, but in the early 19th century, it was actually a really exciting field, and it was very politically engaged on every extreme, from Burkean Tories on the one hand to kind of post-Jacobin levelers on the other. Literary antiquarianism in particular was pretty much an enterprise of reprints. It was an age of reprinting. So opposition to the deposit arose particularly from the people who were devoted to reprinting old works, which the libraries were now claiming to get for free. This led to what was characterized at the time as a rising en masse against the prospect of a universal library, with campaigners including people like Isaac Disraeli, natural philosophers like Thomas Young, physicians like William Lawrence, John Abernethy. For a moment, faced with this near unanimity, it looked like Westminster would actually step in and would abolish the old Copyright Act. The move to do that failed by one vote in the House of Commons at one point. But then fate stepped in the form of the Prince Regent, who, facing the death of the king, dissolved Parliament before it could actually pass a bill. And when it met again, the campaign's leader, who was an eccentric ultra-Tory, had lost his seat and gone into exile. And at that point, the campaign collapsed, and essentially the principle of copyright deposit survived. So it looked like it ended with the libraries on top. But the legacy that it left is actually more confused and more resonant for us than that implies. Because at the peak of their campaign, the publishers and the Romantics had proposed a compromise. They would accept a universal deposit, they said, a universal library. But in return, they demanded a blanket doubling of the copyright term from 14 years, which was what it had stood at since 1710, to 28 years, which is a rather ironic thing, given all the arguments about copyright that the Romantics made, but it kind of shows you who the dominant party were in this alliance. And in 1814, Parliament did pass a new copyright law that enshrined that. It's the first statutory departure since 1710. So 1710 creates copyright. It then continues in statutory terms until 1814, when the term is doubled. And it gave the universities everything they wanted, or rather, it gave them slightly more than they wanted, because thanks to a last-minute one-word amendment, the law extended an explicit right not just to new works, but to those much-contested reprints. So what emerged then was not just the principle of copyright libraries, the closest thing to universal libraries that's existed until now, but also the first breach in a century-long principle that copyright protection was for a fixed short term. It was still for a term, and that term was still defined, but it could no longer be assumed to be fixed. And the consequences of this would be clearest for anyone wanting to reproduce old works, the status of which was suddenly rendered even more unclear, if you like. So that process, that step, creates what becomes a process of lengthening copyright terms. And that's, of course, a process with which we're painfully familiar. It originated with a romantic and commercial rebellion against universal libraries in the early 1800s. It was introduced into the US remarkably quickly. In the 1820s, Noah Webster toured the UK and heard about this debate and the results that it had, and went back to the United States and campaigned there for an extension of the copyright term explicitly on the model of the London Act. And in 1831, it was achieved with a new Copyright Act that in the States doubled the term to 28 years, renewable for another 14. Ever since then, the copyright term has continued to be increased. That set in train a process which has continued down to now. It also set in train, of course, the process of worrying particularly about old works and not new ones, works that might be reintroduced into copyright protection after they otherwise might have dropped out. So the problem with so-called orphan works that's dogged the Google project is a distant legacy of that earlier clash, just as our concerns about romanticism and universality may be. In that sense, far from being a unique product of the internet age, the Google conflict is a consequence of the technologies of the internet being applied to desires and anxieties that are much older. And its problems are, through and through, products of a history of universal libraries in practice. And in particular, the problem of old knowledge or reprints in a universal library is as critical now as it was then. Now, the difference now is that in 1810, economics was not yet the all-pervading authority that it now is, but it was becoming so. It was still controversial. So Disraeli, Longman, and their allies believed that what was going on was central to the fate of culture itself, to knowledge, and they argued for that explicitly. Universality, all sides believed, would affect readers, and it was supposed to. That was what it was for. It would either generate new knowledge via research, as the universities claimed, or lead to innovation in the face of a massive mediocrity, as the Romantics claimed. And that this was then representative, as I say, of a general issue about copyright publishing in writ large. The result that antagonists said would be a deadening of critical instincts and an apathetic reliance on the homogeneity of mass culture. So genius was bound to be a victim of universality. Now, that's a reactionary conception, to be sure, but it's not only a reactionary conception, and it did have a lot of support from the sciences and from commercial publishers. So it makes us think, I think, slightly differently about what's going on now. How will readers today make new knowledge out of this massive, undifferentiated reservoir of digitized work that they now are going to have thrown at them? Will they even want to make new knowledge out of it? What long-term trends might we unintentionally spark in a bid to pacify our own warring factions and to make this project as useful as possible? These are among the questions that I think emerge when we identify the purposes of universal libraries as foci of inquiry. But I want to conclude not by focusing on those questions, but to ask something slightly different. I want to suggest that a focus on uses, on purposes, may also help us answer the question that looms over this entire meeting: why books? Perhaps the positive answer to that question, it really clearly is looking for a positive answer, it lies not in the architecture of the book itself, the codex, though I agree that, as things stand, that's a better architecture than any ebook I've seen, nor in the material aesthetics of look and feel that used to be so widely invoked, nor even in anxieties about monopoly or metadata standards, but in something that came to rise and was translated into English at more or less the same time as this debate about universal libraries, a concern about the maintenance of, if you like, public intelligence, public reason itself. Immanuel Kant's famous account was translated into English in the 1790s, just as this universal libraries debate was gearing up. And it created a tradition of arguing that for public reason to work, you need privacy, you need a space of retreat, an ability to unconnect or disconnect. It's a paradoxical argument in a certain sense, but it's been very influential. And of course, there's a tradition of thinking in these terms. And in that light, if we think of that engineer's comment that the purpose of the Google project is for things to be read by an AI, then the answer to why books might lie in the autonomy, not of books alone, but of the pairing of practice and books, of the pairing of reading with the physical page. This independence, this autonomy is lost when an important purpose of the Universal Library is to make reading into an adjunct to non-display uses. That is, a major purpose of mass digitization, of course, is that it converts not only works, but work viewings, uses, downloads, and so on, into data that are then merged, sorted, combined, analyzed, and mined. To paraphrase that engineer, what AIs are reading are not just books, but us. Now, that process isn't necessarily sinister. In fact, I actually think it's a good thing on balance. But it does warrant a certain caution. For example, in the first 6 months of 2010, Google, by its own profession, received about 4,000 requests from US government agencies of one kind or another for data on uses, on users. Another 1,300 or so from the UK, and thousands more from other governments across the world. Many of these requests are said to relate to criminal cases, though we don't know any of their details. But it's not hard to imagine that practice expanding. To cite a parallel instance which I think is not unsalient, in the UK, since the first term of the Blair government, data on phone tapping by government and public agencies has been made available in the same kind of broad brush way that Google has these requests from government. In 2008, for example, in the UK, state agencies right down to the level of local civic authorities made more than 500,000 requests for phone tapping. Now, it's not, and this doesn't even touch, of course, on private ventures that might do this kind of thing. So what happens when claims of security or morality tempt authorities of any kind or their private subcontractors to make requests of these data that are created now by a universal library, the purpose of which is to collect information, as I say, not just on works, but on work that we do? It's a question. And I think that one of the things about one answer to why books is that it allows us, the books as physical objects, when read, create that space of retreat that may be the space in which public reason can survive in a mode of such information gathering. So I will stop with that.
Good morning. So this is my first time visiting the Radcliffe Institute. I'm delighted to be here. I come with a cold and a scratchy voice, so I'm going to hope the voice holds out. Focus of the session this morning is on storage, and I am going to come back to storage, including in some very particular ways, all the way down at the nanoscale, in fact. But I want to open by first widening the frame a little bit. Jonathan Franzen's novel Freedom was published on Tuesday, August 31st, 2010. Because I had placed an advance order for the electronic edition, that morning I woke to find the text had been wirelessly delivered to the Kindle application on my iPad while I slept. And here it is. I brought it with me. I started reading the same day. I got about 30 or 40 pages in, stopped, and admittedly, I haven't gone back. He's not here today, is he? Not one of the six? Okay. In any case, it's not the literary qualities of Franzen's book that I wish to discuss this morning. Freedom is the biggest literary publishing sensation we've seen since, I suppose, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows in 2007. Whatever one's view of Franzen as a writer, it seems indisputable that the National Book Award winner and Oprah enfant terrible will be a subject of inquiry for some years to come by those who concern themselves with literature and its constellations of luminaries. What will such persons wish to have available to them as elements of the cultural record? Merely a good, clean copy of the text? Even this might not prove completely unproblematic if one isn't careful, since the UK HarperCollins edition was subject to a recall, some 80,000 copies, when it was found to contain errors from an uncorrected proof that was printed by mistake. But of course we all understand we will want much more than just a clean reading text. Depending on our interests, we might well want as many editions and printings and translations as we can lay our hands on, including an exemplar of the corrupt UK edition. We will want Franzen's manuscripts, his notes, his journals, his correspondence. We will want reviews, advertisements, testimonials, and interviews with the author about his work. All of this, of course, is by now standard operating procedure, the stuff of what Jerome McGann usefully termed the textual condition back in 1991. But what is the textual condition of a lead title brought out by a major American publishing house in the year 2010? Well, for one thing, there's the Kindle edition I mentioned at the start. This presents me with several unique options. I can access the popular highlights feature to see passages that other readers have singled out as significant. For example, I know that 256 other readers have taken note of the fact that, quote, the Berglunds were the super guilty sort of liberals who needed to forgive everybody so their own good fortune can be forgiven. And for those interested in that citation, by the way, I can tell you that the passage falls between locations 154 and 159, somewhere in the first 1% of the book, which, yes, I did read. My iPad Amazon Kindle edition, its version 2.3.1 to be exact, also includes extras like a plot summary, lists of characters and important places in the book, memorable quotes, errata, and recommendations for other books I might like, if I like this one. The plot synopsis includes an option to toggle spoilers on and off. Clearly, a serious future student of Franzen's Freedom would have ample cause to wish access to this electronic incarnation along with the printed text, even if we assume the textual content to be the same. But of course, there's more, much more. Moving over to Amazon's online listing for the book, we find, as of this writing, 417 customer reviews, many of them rated and commented by other members of the Amazon community. We can see that the book's current sales rank as of this writing is an unlucky number 13. We can browse a useful list of available formats and editions, including the obligatory audiobook read by one David Ledoux. There is an exclusive 14-minute interview with Franzen for the Amazon Omnivoracious podcast. There is a discussion forum with active threads. We can look inside the book, and more usefully, perhaps, within the limits of fair use, we can perform keyword searches to call up specific passages. There is a link to an unprepossessing 7-page excerpt in PDF format, which we can download. And then there are the other obligatory ports of call. Franzen's official page at his publisher, Faber Strauss Giroux, the Oprah Book Club site, a universe all its own with spiraling nebulae of supplemental material and vast galaxies of discussion forums, dozens and dozens of videos on YouTube capturing Franzen at readings and interviews, even on the street. Unlike, say, Margaret Atwood or Alice Walker, Franzen himself does not appear to blog or tweet, though there have been several Franzen fakes on Twitter. And in case you were wondering, pirated copies of Freedom were reported on the usual torrent sites no later than September 3rd. Enough, or too much. Some will contend that what I've been describing differs only in sheer volume or mass from what has gone before, since public records and personal papers have always offered up formidable manifestations of what Gerard Jennett has usefully termed epitext. Yet I think what we have here is qualitatively different. Even if one wishes to dismiss the import of all of these gathering swallows twittering in the skies, or readers sounding off about Franzen on their blogs, we must acknowledge that the same social media sphere also now bears witness to events like the 2009 election protests in Iran. These were broadcast to the world largely through Twitter and other mobile messaging services, as well as instant video feeds that brought us the image of Neda Aga Sultan fatally shot and bleeding to death in a Tehran gutter. Such things are not disposable or expendable. You'll notice that everything I have been describing thus far is related to the book's publication and reception. I have not yet said anything about the novel's composition, its editing, or production. Franzen himself, according to a recent piece in Time magazine, writes with, quote, a heavy, obsolete Dell laptop from which he has scoured any trace of Hertz and Solitaire down to the level of the operating system. Someday, an archivist is likely going to have to contend with this rough beast, along with Franzen's other computers and hard drives and USB sticks and floppy diskettes and shoeboxes. What does a scholar do when confronted with a file folder with hundreds of different saved versions of a document, some perhaps with track changes turned on to capture a further layer of edits and commentary? What of the writer who works in less austere virtual environments, whose laptop offers us windows into their web browsing habits and family life and MP3 playlists and nocturnal fancies? What of the digital prepress materials at Faber, Strauss, and Giroux? True, some writers still employ longhand or even mechanical typewriters as a step in their composition process, but sooner or later the text will be keyed into a computer, almost always to be further revised. Editors edit electronically, inserting suggestions and emendations and emailing the file back to the author to approve. Publishers use electronic typesetting and layout tools, and only at the very end of this process is the electronic text of the manuscript, by now the object of countless transmissions and transformations, produced as a printed book. In the particular realm of literary and textual scholarship, this means that a writer working today will not and cannot be studied in the same way as writers of the past, since the basic material evidence of their authorial activity, manuscripts, drafts, working notes, correspondence, journals, is, like all textual production, increasingly migrating to the electronic realm. In 1995, the MLA published its Statement on the Significance of Primary Records, asserting the importance of retaining original physical artifacts for evidentiary purposes, even after their text had been microfilmed or digitized for general access. A primary record, the MLA tells us, quote, can appropriately be defined as a physical object produced or used at the particular past time that one is concerned with in a given instance, end quote. The textual condition in which we find ourselves today is one, simply put, where the notion of a primary record can no longer be assumed to be coterminous with that of a physical artifact. And I hear the keyboard twittering. That's clearly the money quote. Electronic texts, files, feeds, and objects of all sorts are also now indisputably primary records. This changes our textual condition in some fundamental ways. For archives, the librarians who John thanked at the outset, for archives and archivists, the challenges and problems begin almost literally on the threshold of the collection's doorstep. What, after all, is being collected? The physical hardware and storage media or the binary data it contains? How is an archive to contend with hardware and devices that have been in someone's attic or basement for decades? What about the volatility of storage media? 5 1/4-inch diskettes, which were introduced in the late 1970s, have already exceeded their estimated lifespan. Even assuming data can be recovered from these media, can they be authenticated, stabilized? Does the data consist of merely complete files or of all of the bits contained on the physical media, including perhaps fragments of overwritten or deleted files? How is this material to be cataloged? A single diskette might contain hundreds of individual files, meaning that an item-level description is prohibitive. A single hard drive will almost certainly contain many thousands of files of all types. How is the archivist to know what belongs to the author, as opposed, for instance, to a family member using the same computer? How can researchers be given access to this material? How will the archivist ensure confidentiality and that sensitive electronic records will not be copied or redistributed indiscriminately? Many in this room will know Henry Petrosky's remarkable book-length history of the pencil. Pencils, those most quotidian of devices, turn out to be ingenious technologies. The introduction of graphite as a medium for writing consolidated the means to inscribe and to erase in the same tool, literally in the palm of the hand. Pencils, therefore, contributed to writing as a mobile activity. For all that, they were not, as Petrosky relates, uncontroversial. Some, for example, found the ability to efface an inscription dangerous, since it compromised the stability of the human record. Computers are writing instruments as well, but they are also much more than a pencil. A computer is an environment, an extension of self. The hard drive is a reflecting pool for our digital lives. A computer is, as J. David Bolter observed long ago, a writing space, one which models, by way of numerous telling metaphors, a complete working environment, including desktop files, even wallpaper. Imagine how much someone could learn about you by going through your laptop. A future scholar who was fortunate enough to have gained total access to an author's computer has found a key to their house with leave to open up file cabinets, look inside the desk drawers, peek at the family photos, see what's playing on the stereo or TV, even sift through what's been left behind in the trash. A number of significant writers already have material in archives in born digital form. The list includes Norman Mailer, John Updike, Alice Walker, Jonathan Larson, composer of Rent, and many others. The best example to date is the amazing curatorial work that's been done at Emory University Library, which has 4 of Salman Rushdie's personal computers in their collection among the rest of his papers. One of these, his first, a Macintosh Performa, is currently available as a complete virtual emulation on a dedicated workstation in the reading room. Patrons can browse Rushdie's desktop file system, seeing, for example, which documents he stored together in the same folder. They can examine born digital manuscripts from Midnight's Children and other works. They can even take a look at the games on the machine. Yes, Rushdie is a gamer. Who knew? The Emory team, it is important to note, are consummate professionals. All of this was done in cooperation with Rushdie himself, and the born digital materials on the emulated Macintosh have been appropriately redacted. In truth, a patron no more has access to Rushdie's complete electronic records than he or she would simply be given carte blanche to help themselves to whatever was in the paper collection. But the Rushdie project, which has thus far processed only a fraction of his born digital materials, has taken 3 years and tremendous resources, justified, of course, by Rushdie's literary and historical significance. What of other writers whose work may not command the same attention and commitment of resources? As early as 1985, D.F. Mackenzie, in his Panizzi lectures, explicitly placed electronic content within the purview of bibliography and textual criticism. Quote, this is Mackenzie, I define texts to include verbal, visual, oral, and numeric data in the form of maps, prints, and music, of archives of recorded sound, film, videos, and any computer-stored information, everything, in fact, from epigraphy to the latest forms of discography. The significance of this formulation is not just its expansiveness or the specific mention of computer data. The intellectual foundation of Mackenzie's entire career as a student of books in their physical form was a ruthless peeling away of abstraction, of the abstractions inherent in bibliographical conjecture. Mere printers of the mind, as the title of his most famous essay, an attack on key assumptions concerning what was known about the printing of certain Shakespearean texts, has it. This ruthless peeling away of abstractions to the material particulars of the medium. The material particulars of the medium, an easy phrase for bibliographers, conservators, and historians of the book to utter, but the problem with the dot textual condition, as I have been sketching it, which is also the assumption behind the MLA's 1995 statement on primary records, is precisely that there are no material particulars to a digital medium. Or are there? So, Lisa knows the answer. I am the co-author of a report to be published next month by the Council on Library and Information Resources entitled Digital Forensics and Born Digital Content and Cultural Heritage Collections. And so here's where we draw back down to storage. Since the rubric of this morning's session is storage, I'd like to give you just a bit of a preview and then I'll close. Digital forensics as a specific technical and curatorial practice begins to equip us with the tools archivists, scholars, and patrons will need to evaluate born digital primary sources in relation to their authenticity, integrity, and, yes, materiality. So what is digital forensics? Digital forensics is an applied field originating in law enforcement, computer security, and national defense. It is concerned with discovering, authenticating, and analyzing data in digital formats to the standard of admissibility in a legal setting. While its purview was once narrow and specialized, catching black hat hackers or nabbing white-collar cyber criminals, the increasing ubiquity of computers and electronic devices means digital forensics is now employed in a wide variety of cases and circumstances. And this, I'm told from law enforcement people who I've spoken to, that handling digital evidence is now something that is routinely taught in the police academies as an aspect of one's basic training. Digital forensics is also routinely employed in counterterrorism, military intelligence. Now, while such activities may seem happily far removed from a setting like this one or the concerns of the cultural heritage sector, the methods and tools developed by forensics experts represent a novel approach to key issues and challenges in the archives and curatorial community. The same forensic software that indexes a criminal suspect's hard drive allows an archivist to prepare a comprehensive manifest of the electronic files a donor has turned over for accession. The same hardware that allows the forensics investigator to create an algorithmically authenticated image of a file system allows the archivist to ensure the integrity of digital content once captured from its source media. The same data recovery procedures that allow the specialist to discover, recover, and present as trial evidence a, quote, erased file may allow a scholar to reconstruct a lost or inadvertently deleted version of an electronic manuscript and do so with enough confidence to stake reputation and career, even tenure. In the forensic sciences, the most relevant precedent for digital forensics is the field of questioned document examination, which dates back to the end of the 19th century. It concerns itself with the physical evidence related to written and printed documents, especially handwriting attribution and the identification of forgeries. While digital data may seem volatile and ephemeral, gone forever at the flip of a switch, or maddeningly out of reach even if the device is in the palm of our hand, in fact, stored data has a measurable physical presence in the world. Stored data is possessed of length and breadth, a fact that accounts for what is known as the areal density of a given piece of storage media. Literally, how closely can bits be packed together on a surface? Currently, areal density on hard drives is upwards of 100 billion bits per square inch. Some scientists argue that we are approaching the superparamagnetic limit, which is the point on the nanoscale at which the physical properties of magnetic media break down. In other words, bits can only be made so small while still retaining their inherent physical properties. While digital forensics rarely descends to this microscopic level, despite the ubiquity of magnifying glasses hovering over keyboards and hard drives in the field's iconography, the inevitable physical residue of data, known as remnants, is the scientific basis of all digital forensics techniques. Even the contents of RAM memory may be subject to forensic recovery under the ideal conditions. In short, there is rarely any computation without some corresponding representation in a physical medium. In point of fact, digital data, in particular magnetic disk storage, are one of the most persistent and indelible forms of inscription we have yet devised. A modern operating system may retain dozens of different copies of what the user perceives as a single homogeneous file. Internet traffic, including websites and email, is cached in numerous locales, often with backup and redundancies at each site. The conclusion to be drawn here is that electronic data are not necessarily any more fragile or given to vanishing into the ether than any other form of inscription, but they are different from prior forms, chiefly because of the fundamentally symbolic nature of the data's encoding. The technical challenges involved in digital preservation are therefore formidable, but the social challenges are greater still as we adjust our habits and assumptions to accommodate these new forms of storage and recording. So the practice of digital forensics is thus a kind of four-way modulation between abstraction and individualization and between volatility and stability. In practical terms, this means we must learn to assess and evaluate multiple levels of a system in order to draw reliable conclusions about the data on any given piece of media. An incorrect system clock, for example, can serve to render a file system's date and timestamps unreliable. Unlike an old-fashioned automobile odometer, where a knowledgeable observer could sometimes tell whether there had been tampering based on telltale signs, like a tendency for digits to stick at certain places, there will be nothing tangible to suggest a computer's internal clock might have been rolled back or reset. This does not mean, however, that evidence from the clock cannot be evaluated effectively by an investigator or scholar with the proper training, either to rule out the possibility of error or tampering. So this is the brief, real sort of hardcore nerd section of the talk. Bear with me. On Unix file systems, including the Mac OS, when a file is created, it is assigned a unique identifier known as an inode number. File systems assign their inode numbers sequentially. Examining the inode numbers associated with a group of files, an activity performed from the Unix command line, can reveal whether they match the creation sequence suggested by the system's date and timestamps. The point in this context today is not the details of the procedure, but rather that peeling away one layer of abstraction brings us not to absolute truth, but to a further layer of computational abstraction, which we can then leverage against the first in order to reach a more informed evaluation about the state of the digital materials in question. Both forensic investigator and cultural heritage professional bear an important responsibility to avoid conjuring users of the mind, as it were. So, because human beings are not angels, as Jerome McGann writes, the textual condition always consists in material negotiations. To conclude, let me briefly characterize the nature of those negotiations, those material negotiations today. First, texts themselves are increasingly networks of transmedia properties. As the example of Franzen suggests, the bigger the book, the more extended its network of transmedia relations becomes. Textual scholarship of the future will consist in the application of techniques from fields like digital forensics, as archivists and other experts work to stabilize, authenticate, and index the born digital materials that now function indisputably as primary records in and of themselves. But scholars will also need to come to grips with massive assemblages of data that will only be susceptible to analysis through text mining and visualization as opposed to traditional close reading. There can be no other way to evaluate the thousands of user reviews on a site like Amazon, for example, other than in aggregate, as streams which we will sift for patterns and anomalies. Today's texts are also inevitably hybrid artifacts, something that's been mentioned already, migrating back and forth between digital and analog states. Nor will the hybridity of the dot textual condition be homogeneous. It will be analog and digital, physical and virtual, but the digital itself will encompass an array of different platforms, systems, formats, and standards, some of which will interoperate and some of which will not, but all of which a future scholar will have to contend with in the same way, for example, that a medievalist does not expect an archivist to transliterate a manuscript's Old English for him or her. Finally, the dot textual condition will be social, by which I mean that the largest challenges will not be technological, but legalistic and societal. Intellectual property law, which we've just heard about, terms of service, end-user license agreements, and so forth, will govern access at least as much or more than media obsolescence, bit rot, or curatorial neglect. The social challenges are where textual scholars can play a leadership role in literary studies and the preservation of born digital literary material, helping to ensure that documents and records survive in useful as well as usable form, just as textual scholars have long fulfilled advocacy roles in traditional library settings, opposing policies that tamper with bindings, dust jackets, and other forms of material evidence. Sociality, hybridity, there goes the voice on the last sentence. Sociality, hybridity, reticulating transmedia effects, these are the stuff of the textual condition, and I'd like to dedicate this talk to Jerry McGann. Thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you both, Matthew and Adrian. I don't know if I can get this one turned up. No? Hello, hello. Yes, there it is. Excellent. Wonderful talks and lots to work from in the next 25 minutes or so by way of discussion. I've got a bunch of cards here. If you have further cards, please pass them up. I'll try to work them in. There are too many, which is good, but we'll start here. I wanted to note two that came in that are actually more in the form of comment than question, although there are question marks involved, but I would note them. One person, Sue Krigsman, writes, this conversation may also want to include systematic purging as well as, instead of, saving everything. Any good librarian and archivist weeds their collection. A related note by a librarian, is there no such thing as ephemera anymore? I can attest to the fact that when I came to the Harvard Law School Library, one of the first things that struck me was the glee that some librarians, Kim Doolan up there with a blinking Mac in the front row, takes in weeding the collection, throwing things out, and then trying to avoid the faculty members who see the books in the dumpster and try to retrieve them again. So I thought that was a good start. There's a very broad question that I think could go to both of you for starters, which really relates to the nature of technology and the humanities. One person asked, will you speak to the broader issue of how technology is impacting the humanities and vice versa? I would add in a couple of notes that came in from Twitter as well. What to do when confronted with file folders of many revisions of a writer's draft. And in a way, I'm reminded of Leaves of Grass, Whitman's collection of poetry, either 6 or 9 versions of which, between 1855 and 1892, is how do those things relate? And I think it touches on aspects of each of your talk in various ways. So maybe start with Adrian and then to Matthew. What is the broader relationship between technology and the humanities?
God, that is such a broad question.
In 140 characters.
Yeah, 140 characters. That'll actually be helpful. Okay. One thing I'll do is just point to the emergence of projects to ask that question. The idea that the history and fortune of the disciplines in general, not just the humanities, may be integrated in some very interesting sense with the history of technologies is something that I think a number of institutions are starting to articulate as a kind of field of inquiry. I know that this is happening in Chicago now, where the local humanities center is inaugurating an effort to ask essentially that kind of question. What's the relation between the history of the disciplines and the future of the disciplines and the changing technological landscape? But let me say one other thing about this, which really comes partly from personal experience. And it relates to something that was said this morning, almost in passing, I think by Stuart, that as we, and it has to do with the question that was raised about the writing of born digital humanistic, what do you call them, texts, entities. Because once you get beyond e-reader devices and you think about using these things with something like an iPad or at any rate a laptop, you're not constrained by the rather ascetic qualities of things like a Kindle, and you can include, multimedia, interactivity, all that stuff. There's great potential here for humanistic or humanistic social scientists to exploit those things to create new kinds of knowledge which can't be written down in a straightforward, even e-book readable form. And some of the electronic monograph productions that have been produced exemplify this. For example, there's a book, I'm afraid I can't remember the title of the author, which is about Goethe's colour theory, which was produced online, maybe as part of the Gutenberg E-project, I can't remember. But it's striking because the reproductions of these color theory diagrams that Goethe uses could not really, it would be very hard to imagine producing a physical book these days that would incorporate those. The implication, I think, though, is one of the practical engagement with these rather utopian possibilities. And anybody who's tried to actually do this kind of thing knows, as Stuart implied, that it can be incredibly time-consuming. And the risk is that in trying to kind of leverage your vision of what you want to produce in the end into what can actually be done, you allow the technological frameworks that currently exist to redefine your questions. It ends up being as much, as it were, epistemologically limiting as it is in principle liberating. The solution to that, I think, possibly lies in, as you just said, in social practices. Somebody needs to come up with a way of integrating the skill sets of technologists with the skill sets of humanists, which is not just a matter of having something like digital humanities in its own building somewhere on a campus. It's a matter of actually having these people in the same room having conversations all the time so that they become, as it were, dyads producing knowledge.
Matthew.
So I would think I would just add to that. There is this field of practice called digital humanities, which, contrary to what you may have read in the Chronicle of Higher Education, did not just originate 6 months ago, but which, in fact, is a discipline and interdisciplinary field that's been around for several decades. One thing that computers have been good at for a very long time is actually text processing, text crunching, and scholars have taken advantage of this capacity literally for decades to do various forms of computational analysis on texts. The humanities, of course, have always been technological. The example of Petrosky and his 400-page study of the pencil reminds us of this as much as anything. But I do think one particular opportunity at this moment, to go back to, I think, the question originated with what do you do with all of those documents and file folders on a hard drive? Leaves of Grass has its 9 different editions or printings. There's a kind of sweet spot, I think, whereby any sort of respectable textual scholar wants complexity of evidence, but not too much complexity before the data starts to become unmanageable. And I think when we're talking about those file folders with hundreds and hundreds of different iterations of branching drafts, the only way that material is going to be susceptible to analysis is through algorithmic techniques, what Adrian was calling machine reading. And so the digital humanities as a community, as a professional research field, has been doing work on text analysis and text mining, again, literally for decades. And I think there's a real opportunity for collaboration between digital humanities, which is actually, I'm not an archivist. I actually self-identify as a digital humanities person. I think there's a real opportunity for collaboration between digital humanities and archives in the realm of digital preservation.
I would add to that, there's a wonderful man visiting here at Harvard, Jeffrey Schnapp, who may be in the room, digital humanist from Stanford. I've learned so much from him, and anyone who has a chance to read his work or listen to him talk, that's an advertisement in the form of Matthew's note. I've got a bunch of others, and I'm going to try to run through them or put them in clusters in front of you guys. Matthew, I'm struck by the idea of the dot textual condition of your talk itself, in a way. As you were giving your talk, someone brought up the following question, which said, what does the future hold for personal collection development as well as for library collection development? Further question there, how will things like iPad apps be archived personally and professionally? Then you mentioned the Salman Rushdie thing in the talk in real time. Then on Twitter, there were a series of notes about how you had anticipated this. So there were people gathering this notion. And then someone said, yeah, you shouldn't, though, be talking about personal computers. You should be thinking about the cloud. How does that affect it, given that this is, in fact, a storage medium? So I stringed together a series of things, both your notes, comments in real time, and Twitter ones, and put them back to you about personal collection development.
Yeah, so I don't think I can tackle all of that, but just to to grab at a few straws. Clearly the cloud, Web 2.0, social media, this is sort of the brick wall that I suspect every sort of archivist or librarian in the room understands they're hurtling towards at a breakneck pace. And as hard as it may be to work with born digital material when the laptop or the floppy diskette or the magnetic tape, whatever it is on a table in front of you, once we're speaking about the cloud, I think we're actually in much trickier terrain because it is governed precisely by those terms of service agreements, by legalistic considerations as much as technological. There's certainly, there have been some efforts we can point to. The work of the Internet Archive, which was mentioned, which does crawl the web and take sort of low-resolution snapshots, if you will. The Library of Congress has recently acquired all 5 terabytes of the Twitter archive, and they're discussing one of the remarkable things about the Twitter archive, despite 50 million tweets a day or whatever the statistic is, it's only 5 terabytes of data, and you can basically fit it on a laptop or two. But the Library of Congress does have Twitter, and I know that they're in discussion about how that material will be made accessible. You can't save everything, of course. I think what we have to remind ourselves when when that observation is proffered, of course there will still be ephemera, but we as citizens of the present have no way of knowing what will or won't constitute ephemera to the people of the future. And so, we can't save everything, but I always get nervous when I hear people prepared to make sort of ruthless distinctions about what is or isn't ephemera, particularly if they're based on medium. So, clearly all of Twitter is not ephemera. That's why I mentioned the 2009 Iranian elections.
Can I
Yes,
say
of course.
something about ephemera? One of the reasons why it's very frustrating that historically ephemera have been ephemeral is that through most of the hand press era, ephemera were basically what printing was for. They were the things that sustained printing as an economic operation, for the most part, not always. And so there is a sense in which the loss of all that material has meant that we, until relatively recently actually, and except for various rather specialist communities, we've had a kind of fundamental misapprehension of what the history of printing was really all about for large parts of its duration. We've tended to assume that books of the kind that libraries store are really what the history of printing was, and that's really not true. I mean, Peter's doing lots of work at this, Peter Stalibras, and the whole operation was sustained by producing an endless circulation of this transient material, almost all of which is now completely lost. And I think one of the issues about whether there's ephemera anymore and whether it continues is that we need, I think, to be thinking what's the kind of economico-social counterpart to the central role that ephemera had in the whole hand press era. What is it that keeps, as it were, the internet going that we're going to lose?
Wonderful series of notes. I should also say, since we're here at the Radcliffe Institute, that one of the very interesting projects underway at Harvard, the web archiving project, is being done in part at the Radcliffe Institute's wonderful library here. I would note also on the score of Twitter, I've been trying to keep up with the tweets to try to keep them coming in. Many of you who tweet will know this screen, which says Twitter is over capacity, which often it is. I think that speaks for itself in terms of its usefulness, perhaps, too. I want to cluster 2 questions about role. The first is directed to Adrian, and the other one to both of you. The first is, did debates over the value of universal libraries include discussions of the role of librarians in guiding readers and or creating collections within the collection? I'm going to put the other one on the table and then let you respond to them both. The second one goes to the role of the individual in an artificial intelligence world, as I see it. The question is, as the digital universal library becomes feasible to create, are individual readers losing the ability to judge authority, accuracy, and value of content. So maybe Adrian, start with you with a librarian question.
It partly depends on how you draw the boundaries around the history of debates about universal libraries. You know, I've deliberately avoided trying to get into issues of definition here because, you know, in a certain sense, no library can ever be universal. That's axiomatic. So you're always talking about historically specific contentions about what universality might be and what a library might be. So you can find very different kinds of institutions being projected as universal information centers at different points in history. So, for example, in the 1920s, there was this project called the Mundaneum in Brussels that was really kind of halfway between an information collection facility and a search engine, in that people were it was certainly supposed to amass media of all kinds, but it was also supposed to be the case that you as citizens could telegraph in questions to it. And they had a staff who would look up the answers by a kind of desktop system that would bring together film and audio recordings and books and newspapers, and they would telegraph back the answer. And that was regarded as a kind of universal. It was actually based on the work of a pioneering scientific bibliographer called Paul Ottley. And I think that for some of these debates, especially in the 20th century, yes, there have been articulations of what role the librarian should have. And Ottley's a great example of that. He wrote a huge book, which is really fascinating, that came out in around 1900, it's on, as it were, the science of being a technological librarian in this world of now multimedial information. It's there in principle in the debates that the Romantics had, but they didn't really investigate, I think, in detail what the role of the librarian was. They think it's very important that there should be such a person doing selection, but they're much more tacit about what the criteria of selection might be and what kind of person you want to be a librarian and that kind of issue. So I think my sense of it is that it's really a 20th century thing. As far as the whether we can still be individuals in an AI reading world, I think we can. I think that we're obviously tracked while we do it. But there are anonymization systems which are a controversial field.
I've got privacy lined up as my last question, so it's coming.
Maybe all I'll say is that I think that through the world of print, from the 15th century, 16th century onwards, readers had to develop skills to do this kind of appraisal about which texts are more authentic, which ones are to be trusted, and in what ways you trust them. And these skills were real and they were distributed, and there were ways of learning them through experience. Readers online do this too. It's hard to track because it's largely, private or done through tacit knowledge. But I still think that they exist. And you can see this in the debates that took place, which have rather come to an end, about trust online in the early generation of the internet, back in the late 80s, mid 90s.
Before we switch over to Matthew, just two little notes, Adrian. One is that one reason Twitter may be overcapacity is that you are a trending topic in Boston, which people have noted. I think that's good, and also credits the Radcliffe Institute for so making you. The other is several people would like me to note to you that integration is precisely the program of the entire emerging field of digital humanities. I'm not sure you were saying something to the contrary, but if you were, you're welcome to respond before we go over to Matthew.
No, I'm very happy. I just look. What I tend to be skeptical of, it's not something that's specific to digital humanities, is the practice, as I see it, in academia for new enterprises to kind of project themselves as disciplines in the making, because I think that doing that has at least as many costs as it has benefits, because disciplines become kind of auto-ghettoizing, if you like. And I see that happening to a certain extent with the digital humanities movement. I mean, to the extent that it's integrative, that's great. Fine. But it's just the idea that sometimes the definition of success is to become a discipline, and I think that's at best a mixed target.
Matthew.
Yeah. I suspect many DH people would sort of actually agree, and I think the aspiration to be a discipline is not necessarily universal. It is to stay on digital humanities for a moment. It is the case that digital humanities is being disciplined in the sense that there is increasing infrastructure around it in the form of course, federal granting agencies like NEH, in the form of centers which become institutionalized at the sort of intersections between disciplines. Of course, in the realm of jobs, where you can now be on the job market as a digital humanist and find work in, say, an English or a history department. So I think the sort of self-projections of a community of people in terms of whether they are or are not a discipline are always going to be at tension, at odds with sort of certain kinds of material infrastructure that in both helpful, I mean, we all want jobs, we all like having resources, but I think this sort of institutionalization of digital humanities has been both helpful and unhelpful. As far as the question of can we still be individuals goes, I think one argument is that we can now be more individual than ever with our iPads and our whole array of, our whole suite of lifestyle devices, all of it excruciatingly profiled and cross-indexed and mined and so forth, where each of us as individuals forms a very precise vector within some sort of vast marketing matrix. So that might be that might not be the particular answer one is looking for, but I also think inevitably we're always limited, if nothing else, by human attention span. And that, as much as anything, I suspect, is what is going to assert our individuality in the coming years.
Wonderful. So I'm going to get to a final question, which is as to privacy. I want to, in passing, though, note a question from Julie and Wheeler. What advances are being made to develop technology to read old print texts with the old F's for S's and so forth and render them into searchable format? This may not be the right topic for you guys in the closing here, but I would note that Dean Gross and others have long been talking about the importance of computer scientists taking up problems of great interest, OCR in this case, and otherwise to librarians. And I believe the Radcliffe Institute is looking toward the spring for some further conversations on this topic that might look at archives and the translation of these materials. So I would forward that either toward people like Dean Gross and Stuart Schieber or to a future conversation in spring. But the last question, or cluster of questions that came in around privacy, there are sort of two variants of it that we've gotten in different ways. One is nicely put in the form of, is there an ethical difference between the FBI doing its forms of digital forensics and the scholar going through Salman Rushdie's email or other archives and so forth? Yes, I suspect there is. And the other way it's been put, now that one is answered, what about where government agencies request information on who uses or borrows what book and from which libraries and other privacy issues? So maybe that would be one on which each of you could end. And if you have any final thoughts you'd like to share, please slip them in as we hurtle toward lunch.
Yeah, sure. I certainly don't mean to make light of the ethical question, and we, in fact, in the CLEAR report that I mentioned, we actually have a whole section devoted to ethics. I think what is, I think probably the most important thing to say is that lots of people are in the process of working this out. So increasingly, archivists find themselves having very particular conversations with prospective donors, not just about the donors' papers, but about their digital storage media and what kinds of forensic analytics might or might not be performed. I think sometimes this can frighten donors away, but I think what's more important is that I think all of us really, as citizens of a networked world, have a responsibility to sort of, at least a basic level, come to terms with what options we have for managing our privacy and our information, what capabilities various agencies, be they governmental or be they cultural heritage institutions, but what capabilities exist for retrieving our personal information, and that kind of education that I think is really what is essential, and it's beginning to go forward, I think. Library of Congress has been doing a good job with outreach efforts, and you're starting to see it happen.
Great. The last word, Adrian Johns.
Thank you. I'm not sure I have a very dramatic last word. It seems to me this is the issue of things like the distinction between FBI inquiries and the kinds of forensics that can be done by archivists, say. It relates to that earlier question about whether we can still be individuals. We can be individuals, but individual means different things. And one of the things that's been very striking about the rise of broad, kind of technocratic digital communities is that they can be awfully libertarian in a kind of neoclassical way, a kind of John Stuart Mill sense. And some of the anthropologists, like Gabrielle Bielman, have looked at this and have tried to trace why it is that these communities of digerati adopt these very strong moralistic libertarian notions. That's a very, very particular notion of individuality. It doesn't, for example, have a very rich sense of the self. The question really is, and if one is just an individual of that kind, then the risks, the caution that one has about things like forensics exercised by the state or big corporations on us is, I think, rather minimized. It doesn't matter so much. The question becomes much more important when you think of us as being individuals in something like a richer kind of Kantian sense or something like that. Now, I've occasionally thought, I don't think I'm ever going to actually do this, but I've thought about trying to write a new Areopagitica. Milton's great work against censorship in the 17th century, which I think is largely actually about the responsibilities of readers. And because Milton's very it's very kind of typical Milton. The idea is that to be a reader in a civic policy, you have to be a worker. You have to work hard. And there's a famous image of people sitting up late in London, burning the midnight oil to compare, yielding to the force of reason and convincement, as he says. And I think there's a counterpart to that in the digital world. There is a responsibility, or ought to be there is a responsibility on people who engage in the digital world not to be merely those kinds of consumptive individuals, but to be richer, inquisitive individuals at a recursive level about the very structure of what it is that they're interacting with. So this is why I'm a bit skeptical about iPads, for example, because notoriously the Apple ecosystem is kind of sheeny and self-contained. The thing is that if one is going to have what you've just described as the ability to be cautious about what's happening to your data, that involves necessarily a certain degree of technical expertise and a responsibility to kind of delve down into the system. And I think that's the modern counterpart for citizenship of Milton's idea of readers yielding to the force of reason and convincement. So yes, I think that you can be an individual, but you need to be an active, engaged one.
So, by way of thank you, I can assure you that these were two of the best talks I've heard in a very long time, and I suspect others would agree. And also, what a rich and wonderful set of topics that you've unearthed by talking about storage and retrieval in the context of books. Please join me in thanking Adrian Johns and Matthew Kirschenbaum.